The emperor gave me power. He did it on the day I should have been destroyed, the day I publicly broke the most sacred custom of the empire. Everyone was watching, the entire court. They were all waiting for the guards to take me. I was waiting for it too. I had accepted it, but he didn't give the signal. He just watched me, and then he spoke, and with a few words, he broke 1,000 years of tradition. He gave me power instead of punishment. That was the moment I truly became afraid. My name is Aurelia Merrow. You wouldn't have heard of my family. We're not one of the great houses. We don't command armies or control trade. We're just present. We've always been at court. We are the memory of the institution. My education was not for leadership. It was for correctness. I learned the histories, the rights, the precedents. I was trained to be a living archive. My purpose was to ensure that rituals were performed exactly as they had been for centuries. I was supposed to be a guardian of the past, invisible in the present. I was never meant to have a voice. I was meant to be a reference, a footnote in the Imperial record. That was the life I was prepared for. Quiet, marginal, safe. In the Empire, custom is not just about tradition. It is the law. It is the structure that holds everything up. The rules tell you where to stand, when to speak, how to bow. They define your worth, your position, your entire existence. You follow the rules, and you are part of the system. You are protected. You deviate, even slightly, and you are a threat. You are removed. There is no room for interpretation. There is only obedience. That was the first thing every child of the court learned. I learned it too. I just learned it too well. I spent my years in the Imperial libraries, in the archives. I read the original texts. I studied the evolution of every ceremony. I understood not just what we did, but why we did it. And that's where the problems began. I started to see the gaps, the differences between the original intent of a custom and its modern execution. I saw how rituals designed to ensure justice were now used to enforce loyalty. I saw how traditions meant to limit power were now used to consolidate it. The symbols were the same, but their meaning had been hollowed out. They had become tools, weapons even. And I saw the powerful people at court wielding these customs with perfect precision. They could destroy a rival, ruin a family, or seize property, all while appearing to be paragons of tradition. They were following the letter of the law while violating its soul. It was a perfect, elegant lie, and the whole court was participating in it. This knowledge didn't make me angry. It was too vast, too systemic for anger. It just made me feel separate, like I was reading a different language than everyone else. I saw the architecture of the system, and I could see the cracks in the foundation. I just never thought I would be the one to put my hand on the wall and push. Then came the ceremony of Imperial renewal. It only happens once a decade. It is the single most important ritual in the Empire. It is a public reaffirmation of the bond between the emperor and the state. It is meant to project an image of unbreakable stability. For this ceremony, perfection is not an aspiration. It is a requirement. Any error, any deviation is seen as a terrible omen. I had a role in it, a very small mechanical role I had performed before. I was the keeper of the annals. My task was to carry the great book of Imperial record to the foot of the throne at a precise moment. It's a symbolic act, history presented to power. I walk, I place the book on its stand, I bow, I walk away. Simple. But this time, it wasn't simple. In the months leading up to the ceremony, I knew something was wrong. The political maneuvering at court was more vicious than usual. The factions were circling each other. A man named Cassian was in the center of it. His house was a minor one, like mine. He was an administrator known for being fair and efficient. And that was the problem. His efficiency had disrupted the corrupt arrangements of several powerful nobles. They wanted him gone, but they couldn't attack him directly. He was too clean, so they decided to use the ceremony of renewal to break him. It was a subtle plan, a masterpiece of political sabotage disguised as ritual. They planned to alter a single prayer in the middle of the ceremony. They would revert to an archaic version that hadn't been used in 200 years. The change was approved in a closed committee, buried under dozens of other procedural adjustments. No one would notice. No one except me. It was my job to know such things. Cassian's part in the ritual came immediately after this prayer. He was supposed to give a traditional response, but his response was for the standard prayer. When the archaic version was read, his correct, practiced words would suddenly sound wrong. It would sound like a failure, a public display of ignorance, or worse, a deliberate act of dissonance. In the context of the renewal ceremony, it would be interpreted as a sign of disloyalty. He would be disgraced, his career would be over, his family would be tarnished, and it would all be done without anyone laying a hand on him. It would be a death by custom. I could have done nothing. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. Cassian was not my friend. He was just a man I respected. This was not my fight. My family advised me to keep my head down. They knew what happened to people who got in the way of the powerful, but they were using my world to do it. They were using history. They were twisting the very symbols I had dedicated my life to understanding. The annals I was meant to carry represented the truth of the Empire's past. And in that moment, the ceremony was being used to enact a lie about its present. I couldn't accept the contradiction. I didn't want to cause chaos. I didn't want to make a scene. I just felt this cold, clear duty to correct the record, to make the symbol mean what it was supposed to mean. So I made a plan, a very simple, very direct plan. I decided that when my moment came, I would not just perform my role, I would use it. I knew what the punishment would be: disgrace, exile, maybe worse. I accepted the cost. I thought it was a price worth paying to protect the integrity of the ritual. That was my miscalculation. I thought the Emperor cared about the integrity of the ritual. I was wrong. He was playing a much, much bigger game. The day of the ceremony arrived. The Great Hall was full. Every noble, every general, every important official in the Empire was there. The air was thick with expectation. The weight of 1,000 years of history was in that room. The ceremony began. It proceeded just as it always did. The chants, the processions, the oaths, all perfect, all precise. I stood in my designated place, holding the great book. It felt heavier than usual. I watched as the moment approached. The high priest stepped forward to recite the prayer. I heard him begin the archaic version, the wrong version. I saw a flicker of satisfaction on the faces of certain nobles. They thought their plan was working. I saw Cassian standing ready, a look of calm focus on his face. He had no idea what was about to happen to him. Then the prayer ended. There was a pause, the moment for Cassian's response, but before he could speak, it was my turn. My role was to walk to the throne. But there were two paths, the direct path and a slightly longer ceremonial path that circled the central dais. The direct path was standard. The ceremonial path was reserved for times of crisis or major announcements. I took the ceremonial path. It was a small act, but in that room, it was a shout. Everyone noticed. A murmur went through the court. I had broken the sequence. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me. I kept walking. I kept my pace steady. I reached the stand at the foot of the throne. I placed the book on it. Then, instead of bowing and retreating, I did the one thing no one is ever supposed to do. I opened the book. It was a clear, undeniable violation. The book is a symbol. It is never opened during the renewal. It is never to be read from. I turned the pages to a specific section, the part that detailed the proper conduct of the ceremony, the part that specified the correct prayer. I put my finger on the passage, and then I just stood there, in silence. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. My action was the message. I had publicly declared that the ritual was being performed incorrectly, that the custom had been broken by those at the very top. The entire ceremony came to a halt. The high priest stood frozen. Cassian looked confused. The nobles who had planned his downfall looked furious. The silence was absolute. Everyone was looking at the emperor. They were waiting for the order for my arrest, for my removal, for my public humiliation. I looked at him too. I was ready. The emperor had not moved. He just sat on the throne, watching me. His face was unreadable. He did not look angry. He did not look surprised. He just looked interested. He let the silence stretch for what felt like an eternity. He let the entire structure of the ritual crumble in real time. That was more terrifying than any punishment. His inaction was a statement in itself. Finally, he raised a hand. Not to the guards. He beckoned me forward. The emperor's finger, a single pale digit, had moved. It was not a grand gesture, nothing to match the scale of the Great Hall or the gravity of my crime. It was a simple, quiet motion, a summons. Silence is not merely the absence of sound. In the Imperial court, it is a physical pressure, an architectural element as real as the marble columns that held up the ceiling. The silence that followed the emperor's gesture was the heaviest I had ever known. It was a structural silence, one that held the weight of 1,000 years of precedent, and I had just fractured its foundation. I walked. The path from the archivist's lectern to the foot of the obsidian throne was not long in distance, but it was a journey across a chasm of custom. An archivist does not approach the throne. An archivist does not move during a ceremony unless dismissed. An archivist certainly does not walk the central aisle, the sunstone path, which was reserved for the emperor, his designated heir, and the formal processions of imperial renewal. My every step was a fresh violation. I could feel the burning gaze of the court, the collective shock of hundreds of nobles who understood the rules better than they understood their own children. They were not watching a woman walk. They were watching the sacrilege of a system being dismantled before their eyes. The great book of imperial record was still in my hands. It felt heavier than it had a moment ago, no longer just vellum and ink, but an object of immense political gravity. I kept my eyes on the geometric patterns of the sunstone path, each inlaid tile a perfect, unbending shape. I saw the system I had dedicated my life to studying, the rigid order I had sought to protect. Now, my feet were defiling it. I reached the dais and stopped at the prescribed distance, 10 paces from the throne's first step. I did not kneel. Kneeling was a part of a ritual I was no longer in. I was outside the system now, a variable the architects of this ceremony had never accounted for. I simply stood, held the book, and waited. The emperor did not look at the disgraced nobles. He did not look at Cassian, whose life hung suspended in the silent air. He looked only at me. His eyes were dark, and they held an unnerving stillness, the placid surface of a deep and dangerous lake. There was no anger there. There was something far worse: interest. "You opened the great book," he said. His voice was not loud, yet it filled the hall, a testament to the room's perfect acoustics and his absolute command of it. It was a statement of fact. "I did, Your Majesty," I replied. My own voice was a ghost, thin and dry, but it did not tremble. The scholar in me would not permit it. "The book has not been opened in 400 years. Not since the Ash Concordat, when its closure became the symbol of a unified, immutable code of law. To open it is to suggest the code is mutable," he continued, his tone conversational, as if we were discussing a point of obscure history in a quiet library. "To suggest the empire itself is mutable, a capital offense." "The symbol was being used to enact a lie, Your Majesty," I said, my words precise. "A symbol's integrity is derived from the truth it represents. When it is used to conceal a falsehood, the symbol itself becomes a falsehood. The system begins to corrupt." A low murmur rippled through the assembled houses, a sound of outrage and disbelief. I had not only committed the crime, I was now justifying it with academic arrogance. I was explaining the architecture of the system to its architect. The emperor raised his hand again, and the murmur died instantly. "You speak of the system. You are a student of it. Aurelia Merrow, of the minor house of Merrow. Your family has tended the lesser archives of the Western Province for generations. You were given a court position because of your perfect recitation of the rites of ascension at age 12. You are a living record." He was not reading from a document. He was reciting me. He knew my file, my history, my purpose. "Your function is to observe, to record, not to act. To record a lie is to participate in it," I stated. "My function is to preserve the integrity of the record." The ceremony was being performed incorrectly. The prayer was altered to engineer a man's ruin. That is a flaw in the execution of the ritual. "A corruption? You could have done nothing," the emperor observed, his head tilting slightly. "It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. Cassian of House Valerius is not your ally. His family and yours have no connection. Saving him gains you nothing." "This was not about saving a man," I said, and for the first time I met his gaze directly. "It was about saving a ritual. The man was merely the component the system was poised to incorrectly discard." The corner of the emperor's mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. It was the most terrifying expression I had ever seen. It was the expression of a man who had been watching a complex game and had just seen a pawn make a move no one could have predicted. He was silent for a long moment, his eyes sweeping over the court. I saw the conspirators, their faces pale masks of fury. I saw Cassian, his expression a ruin of confusion and dawning fear, not for himself, but for me. The emperor's gaze finally returned to me, and it was sharp, decisive. "You are correct," he said, and the silence in the hall fractured into 1,000 gasps. "The system has revealed a flaw, a vulnerability. It has become a structure so rigid that its own rules can be used as weapons to sabotage its purpose. A system that cannot adapt to threats from within is a dying system." He rose from the obsidian throne. The motion was fluid, economical. In the empire, The emperor only stands to issue a decree or to pronounce a sentence of death. Every noble in the room, myself included, braced for the latter. For generations, the integrity of our customs has been entrusted to the collective honor of the great houses, the emperor announced, his voice resonating with a new, colder authority. That trust has been compromised. An honor system is only as strong as its most dishonorable member. Therefore, a new mechanism of enforcement is required. He descended the first step of the dais, then the second. He stopped directly in front of me, so close I could see the intricate gold thread in his dark tunic, a pattern like a circuit diagram. He was a tall man, and he loomed over me not with physical intimidation, but with the sheer pressure of his presence. You have demonstrated a unique, if disruptive, understanding of the spirit of the law, not merely its letter, he said, his voice now lower, for me alone, though all could hear. You have shown that the final arbiter of truth cannot be a text that can be ignored or a custom that can be twisted. It must be a mind, one that understands the why behind the what. He reached out and placed his hand not on the book, but on my shoulder. The touch was light, yet it anchored me in place, a pin driven through a specimen. Therefore, I am creating a new office. By imperial decree, I name you Aurelia Merrow, the first arbiter of the imperial record. He turned his head, addressing the stunned court once more. The arbiter will have a singular and absolute authority. She will have the power to halt any ritual, to question any pronouncement, and to veto any official act of custom she deems a violation of the integrity of the imperial record. Her judgment in these matters will be second only to my own. Her office will be the final safeguard against the corruption of our most sacred traditions. He let go of my shoulder. The power he had just described settled over me, a suffocating weight. It was not a shield. It was a target. He had not punished the conspirators who had tried to ruin Cassian. He had not needed to. He had just created their jailer and handed her to them on a silver platter. Every noble house that had ever bent a rule, that had ever used a custom for its own gain, now had a single, identifiable enemy: me. The ceremony of renewal is concluded, the emperor declared, his voice cutting through the shock. It has served its purpose. It has renewed the empire. He turned and ascended the steps to his throne without a backward glance. The spell was broken. Nobles began to breathe again, to whisper, to shift. The conspirators, led by the Duke of Rose, shot me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was a promise of a death by 1,000 cuts, a political annihilation from which there would be no recovery. Cassian, now safe, looked at me with an expression of profound pity. He understood. I had not been rewarded. I had been weaponized. I was left standing alone on the sunstone path, the great book still in my hands. The emperor watched me from his throne, his face once again an unreadable mask. He had seen me violate royal custom, an act that should have meant my execution. Instead of punishing her, he gave her power. I had thought, in my scholarly naivete, that I was correcting a small error in the grand system. I was wrong. I had not corrected an error. I had become one, a new, unprecedented variable in the empire's oldest equation. The emperor hadn't fixed the flaw I had exposed. He had merely given it a name. He had given it my name. The emperor departed. He did not look back. The silence he left behind was a physical thing, a pressure against the ears. For a long moment, no one in the great hall moved. The intricate clockwork of the court had ceased. Hundreds of the empire's most powerful figures, Dukes and ministers, generals and magistrates stood frozen, their faces a gallery of disbelief. They had come to witness a quiet, procedural execution, a death by custom. They had seen a foundation stone of their world dislodged instead. I stood on the dais, the echo of the Emperor's decree still ringing in the vast space. Arbiter of the Imperial record. It was a title that had not existed an hour ago. It was a role with no precedent, no established rituals to govern its use. He had not fixed the flaw in the system. He had created a new, unpredictable variable and given it my name. My gaze swept across the hall. I saw the Duke of Valerius, his face pale with fury, his hand resting on the pommel of his ceremonial sword as if to keep from drawing it. I saw the High Magistrate, a woman whose entire career was built on the unyielding interpretation of precedent, staring at me as if I were a tear in the fabric of reality itself. They were the architects of Cassian's disgrace. The Emperor had not punished them. He had simply given me the authority to dismantle their work. He had not saved me. He had armed me. The spell broke. A low murmur rippled through the assembled nobles, a sound like grinding stone. They were recalibrating, their minds processing the shift in the architecture of power. I was no longer Aurelia Mero of the archives, a minor functionary from a forgotten family. I was a disruption, an obstacle, a target. I descended the 3 steps from the dais. The marble felt cold and slick beneath my simple shoes. Every eye followed me. In the Empire, custom is not just about tradition. It is the law. It is the structure that holds everything aloft, and I had just been handed a hammer. Someone moved to intercept me. It was Cassian. His face was drawn, the relief of his salvation warring with a clear and intelligent fear. He was a good man, an honest administrator who understood the mechanics of the court far better than I did. He understood what the Emperor had truly done. He stopped a respectful distance from me and bowed, a precise, formal gesture. "Lady Arbiter," he said. The title was a foreign weight on his tongue. "My life and honor are yours. I am in your debt." I met his gaze. His gratitude was a burden I could not afford to carry. "You are in the Emperor's debt, Administrator Cassian," I said. My voice was steady, betraying none of the tremor I felt in my bones. I acted to preserve the integrity of the record. The subject was incidental. It was a cold response, a necessary one. To accept his personal loyalty would be to create a faction of 2. An alliance so laughably small it would be crushed before the day was out. My power, if it was to function at all, had to be impersonal. It had to be rooted in the same abstract principles I had sought to defend. Loyalty to a person was a weakness. Loyalty to a system was a shield. Cassian understood. I saw the knowledge in his eyes. He saw the space the Emperor had placed between me and the rest of the world. He inclined his head again, a gesture of comprehension. "Of course, Lady Arbiter, the integrity of the record is paramount." He stepped aside. The path to the great bronze doors of the hall was clear. It was the longest walk of my life. The courtiers parted before me. They did not bow. There was no custom for bowing to an arbiter, but they created a wide, silent channel for my passage. The air was thick with their unspoken assessments. I was a problem to be solved, a threat to be neutralized. I could feel the weight of their minds at work, the political maneuvering already beginning. They were searching for the rules of this new game, for the leverage points they could use against me. I kept my eyes fixed on the doors. I did not look at their faces. To do so would be to acknowledge them, to engage. My power existed in the abstract, in the office the Emperor had created. To them, I had to be a symbol, not a person. A person could be intimidated. A person could be broken. I walked past the disgraced Valerius entourage, their plot exposed, but their power undiminished. I walked past the neutral parties, their faces carefully blank, waiting to see which way the new currents would flow. I walked past allies of Cassian who offered subtle, hopeful nods I could not return. Each step was a deliberate act of will. I was not fleeing. I was making a strategic retreat to the only ground where I held the advantage. The guards at the entrance pulled the massive doors open. I did not thank them. I did not acknowledge them. I stepped from the oppressive, gilded theater of the great hall into the quiet stone corridor beyond. The doors closed behind me with a boom that echoed like a vault being sealed. I was alone. I was wrong. I was being watched. From every archway and alcove, the Imperial Guard observed me, their black and gold uniforms stark against the grey stone. They had not been there before. They were for me, a detail, an honor, a cage. I ignored them and continued my walk. My footsteps were the only sound. The archives were my sanctuary. A labyrinth of shelves rising into the shadowed vaults of the palace's oldest wing, filled with the scent of aging paper and binding glue. It was a place of silence, but it was the silence of accumulated knowledge, not of fear. Here, the Empire's history was stored. Not the version performed in the Great Hall, but the unvarnished record. Treaties, census data, legal rulings, military dispatches. The truth in all its messy and inconvenient detail. I had always felt safe here. Now, that safety felt like a memory. I walked to my small office, a chamber tucked away in the section for pre-unification legal codes. The guards did not follow me inside, but two took up positions at the entrance to the corridor. Their presence was a constant reminder. My world had shrunk to the size of this room. I sat at my desk, my hands flat on the worn wood. The silence pressed in, no longer comforting. It gave me space to think, and my thoughts were a torrent. The Emperor's Gambit. That is what it was. It was not reform. A reformer would have punished the Duke of Valerius. A reformer would have begun the painstaking work of reinforcing the system's cracked foundations. The Emperor had done neither. He had watched the system fail and, instead of repairing it, had introduced a destabilizing agent. Me. My purpose was not to fix the customs. It was to break them. By giving me the power to veto any ritual, he had forced the court's corruption into the open. Before, the rot was hidden in subtle misinterpretations, in whispers and altered texts. Now, to subvert a custom, they would have to go through me. Their sabotage would have to become public. They would have to challenge the arbiter. I was a diagnostic tool. I was the foreign body introduced into the system to provoke a reaction, to make the disease reveal itself. The Emperor would watch the ensuing inflammation, see who fought me and how they fought. He would use me to map the networks of conspiracy and dissent. The realization settled into my bones with the chill of a crypt. This was not a reward for my integrity. It was a sentence. He had handed me a power that I could only use by making enemies, and he would sit back and take notes on who those enemies were. The more effective I was at my job, the more isolated and endangered I would become. A soft knock came at my door. One of the new guards stood in the doorway, his expression impassive. "Lady Arbiter," he said, his voice a low monotone. "The Chamberlain sends this, by order of the Emperor." He stepped inside and placed a heavy, velvet-wrapped object on my desk. It was a long, slender box of dark, polished wood. He bowed and retreated, leaving me alone with it. My hands trembled as I unwrapped the velvet. The box was inlaid with a single line of mother of pearl. I lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of deep blue silk, was a seal. It was not the grand ceremonial seal of a ministry, but something smaller, more personal. A cylinder of obsidian, capped in gold, cool to the touch. The carving on its base was intricate, a stylized open book, oozer in a balanced scale, the symbol of my office, the arbiter's seal. With this, I could invalidate a decree. With this, I could halt a state ceremony. With this, I could countermand a duke or a magistrate in matters of custom. It was the tangible manifestation of the emperor's will. I picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. It was the weight of a power I had never sought, a weapon I did not know how to wield. The emperor had given me the authority to judge the integrity of the empire's most sacred traditions. He had made me the enemy of all who profited from their decay. I closed my hand around the cool obsidian. The game was not over. It had just begun, and the opening move had left me standing alone in the center of the board. The emperor did not dismiss the court. He simply stood, turned, and walked from the dais. The twin lines of his personal guard, the silent praetorians in their obsidian armor, fell into step behind him. He did not look back. He did not need to. His decree was a stone dropped into a still pool. He had left the rest of us to contend with the ripples. Silence remained. It was a different kind of silence than the one that had followed my transgression. That had been a sharp, horrified vacuum. This was a heavy, pressurized thing, thick with calculation. I could feel the weight of hundreds of pairs of eyes, the same eyes that had watched me expecting my death. Now they watched me with something new. It was not respect. It was appraisal. I had not been punished. I had been given power. In the empire, these are not opposites. They are often the same thing. My title, Arbiter of the Imperial Record, echoed in the vast chamber. It was a title that had not existed an hour ago. It had no precedent, no established rituals, no place in the intricate choreography of the court. I was a living violation of custom, now sanctioned by the source of all custom. The emperor had not fixed the flaw in the system I had exposed. He had simply created a new, unpredictable component and inserted it into the heart of the machine. He had made me the flaw. Slowly, like a glacier carving into the sea, the court began to move. The rigid formations of the noble houses fractured. Lords and ladies turned to their neighbors, their faces perfect masks of decorum, but the whispers were a sibilant tide rising around me. They were not speaking to me, but about me. I was no longer Aurelia Merrow, third archivist of the lesser house of Merrow. I was a new piece on the board, one whose moves were unknown, an object, a problem. I remained where I stood, a solitary island in the center of the mosaic floor. To move felt like a concession. To stay felt like an act of defiance I no longer had the strength for. My heart, which had been a frantic bird against my ribs, was now a slow, heavy drum. This was not the relief of survival. It was the cold dread of understanding. The emperor had not saved me from the lion's den. He had just painted a target on my back and thrown me to a different set of beasts. A figure detached himself from a knot of soberly dressed administrators near the western colonnade. He walked toward me, his steps measured. It was Cassian, the man whose career, whose life I had saved. His face was pale, His expression, a mixture of profound gratitude and an even more profound terror. He stopped a respectful 5 paces from me, a distance dictated by the new invisible boundary of my station. He bowed, a low, formal gesture that felt like a chasm opening between us. "Arbiter," he said. The title was foreign on his tongue. "Cassian," I replied, my voice a dry rasp. I wanted to tell him to stand straight, to dispense with the formality. But the rules had already changed. He was an administrator. I was something else. To reject his bow would be another violation, a political act I could not begin to calculate. "I owe you a debt that cannot be repaid," he said, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere near my feet. He did not look at my face. It was the proper way to address a superior one did not know well. We were strangers now. "You owe me nothing," I said, and the words were true. I had not acted for him. I had acted for the integrity of a ritual. I had acted to correct a line of text. He was a consequence, not a cause. The record was in error. It was my duty to see it corrected. He finally lifted his gaze, and in his eyes I saw that he understood far more than I had given him credit for. He did not see a savior. He saw a sacrifice. "The duty of an archivist is to the record," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the rising murmur of the court. "Your new duty is to survive. Be careful, Arbiter. The vipers you exposed do not forgive." He bowed again, a sharp, final gesture, and retreated. He melted back into the crowd, leaving me more alone than before. He had given me the only thing he could, a warning. It was a gift I already possessed. Another man approached, this one clad in the austere grey of the palace chamberlain's office. He was old, his face a map of wrinkles, but his back was straight, his movements precise. He, too, stopped at the prescribed distance. "Arbiter Merrow," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "I am Chamberlain Valerius. The Emperor has commanded that you be escorted to your new office." My office? The words themselves were an absurdity. My office was a small, dust-filled carrel in the great archives, a place of quiet solitude and the scent of aging paper. It was my sanctuary. I knew this new place would be nothing of the sort. "Of course, Chamberlain," I managed. He gave a curt nod. "This way." I followed him. The courtiers parted before us, creating a silent corridor. No one met my eye. It was as if I had become a ghost, my presence felt but not acknowledged. They were letting me pass, but they were also defining my isolation. I walked past the great houses, past the military commanders, past the ministers of state. Each face was a closed book, written in a language of power I was only just beginning to learn. I saw Lord Valerius, the architect of the plot against Cassian, standing with his faction. His face was serene, but his eyes, when they flicked toward me for a fraction of a second, were chips of obsidian. There was no anger in them. There was only a cold, reptilian focus, the look of a predator identifying an obstacle. The Chamberlain led me from the great hall through a series of corridors I had never walked. The architecture shifted. The soaring public spaces of the court gave way to narrower, unadorned hallways of polished marble and dark wood. This was the administrative heart of the Imperial Palace, the system of arteries and veins that kept the empire running. The air grew cooler, the sounds more muted. Here, power was not performance, it was paperwork, it was structure. We stopped before a heavy door of ironwood, flanked by 2 Praetorian guards. Their presence was the first true measure of my new status. They were the Emperor's own. They did not guard people, they guarded assets. Their burnished armor absorbed the light. Their faces were hidden behind impassive masks. Were they here to protect me or to watch me? In the Emperor's calculus, it was likely both. The Chamberlain produced a key. The lock turned with a heavy, final sound. He pushed the door open and gestured for me to enter. "The office of the Imperial Arbiter," he announced to the empty room. I stepped inside. The room was large, circular, and sterile. It was the opposite of my archive carrel in every conceivable way. There was no comfortable clutter, no towering stacks of scrolls, no scent of history. A single, enormous desk of polished black stone sat in the center of the room, its surface a perfect, empty mirror. Behind it, a tall, arched window looked out not upon the city or the sky, but upon an internal courtyard, a severe geometric space of stone and gravel where nothing grew. It was a room designed for isolation. On the center of the desk lay a single object, a lacquered scroll case sealed with the Emperor's personal sigil. The Chamberlain remained at the door. "Your effects from the archives will be brought to you. You will be assigned a clerk and a seneschal by day's end. Your meals will be brought here. Any requests you have are to be submitted in writing to my office." He paused. "Do you have any immediate needs, Arbiter?" "No, Chamberlain. Thank you." He nodded and pulled the door shut. The latch clicked, a sound of immense finality. I was alone. I walked to the stone desk, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I ran my hand over its cold, unyielding surface. This was my power. A room, a title, and 2 guards outside the door. I looked at the scroll case. It was the physical manifestation of the Emperor's decree. My authority, my weapon, my leash. I did not open it. I already knew what it said. I walked to the window and looked down at the sterile courtyard. I finally understood. The Emperor did not care about the corruption I had found. The decay was not a disease to be cured. It was a condition to be managed or studied. He had seen the intricate web of lies and maneuvers that held his court together, and instead of untangling it, he had chosen to see what would happen if he pulled on a single, critical thread. I was that thread. An arbiter with the power to veto any act of custom is not a tool for reform. In a system built on custom, it is a tool for sabotage. Every petition, every ceremony, every promotion that came before me would now be a test. If I approved it, I would be sanctioning the system as it was, becoming complicit in its decay. If I vetoed it, I would make an enemy. The Emperor had not given me the power to fix the system. He had given me the power to break it, piece by piece, and in doing so, force his enemies to reveal themselves in their attempts to stop me. I was not a judge. I was a diagnostic tool. I was a knife designed to be thrust into the guts of the Empire to see what poisons would bleed out. And a knife, once used, is often discarded. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window, a pale, tired woman in the plain robes of a scholar standing in a room built for a giant. The power was real, the authority was absolute, and I had never been in more danger in my entire life. The silence that followed the Emperor's decree was not empty. It was a dense, heavy thing, filled with the weight of 1,000 unasked questions and 1,000,000 calculations. As the Emperor turned and departed the Great Hall, his Imperial Guard closing around him like a sheath of steel, that silence broke not into sound, but into movement. The court began to dissolve. I remained standing on the dais, a solitary figure in the vestments of an archivist. The symbols of my old life clung to me, but their meaning had been hollowed out. I was no longer Aurelius Mero, a scholar from a minor house. I was the arbiter of the Imperial record. The title was a brand. I walked down from the platform. The journey across the mosaic floor, a path I had taken 100 times in near invisibility, was now a gauntlet. No one spoke to me. No one met my eye. But I felt their attention as a physical pressure. Before, I had been a part of the hall's intricate architecture, a functional but unnoticed detail. Now I was a fault line running through its foundation. Lords and ladies, ministers and functionaries, they parted before me. It was not a gesture of respect. It was the caution one affords a dangerous, unpredictable instrument. Power in the empire is a current. It flows along established channels, codified by centuries of ritual and precedent. The emperor had not merely given me authority, he had blasted a new, unnatural channel through the landscape of the court. I was a river running uphill. Everyone was waiting to see which way the flood would break. My quarters were no longer my own. When I reached the modest archway that led to my simple rooms near the Grand Archives, 2 members of the Imperial Guard stood at attention. Their lacquered armor was the color of dried blood, their faces impassive. They did not speak, but one opened the door for me. The room inside was the same, yet entirely altered. My reading desk was still there, a half-read scroll on the history of trade compacts lying open upon it. My cot was still pressed against the wall, but the space felt different, curated. An attendant I did not recognize stood near the window. "Arbiter," he said, his head bowed to the precise customary angle reserved for a high minister. "Your presence is required in the Arbiter's chancellery. All has been prepared as the Emperor commanded." The Arbiter's chancellery. The name was a fiction, an invention of the last hour. There was no such place. There had never been a need for one. "Where is it?" I asked. My voice was steady. It was the voice of an archivist asking for a location, a simple request for data. "The apartments of the disgraced Lord Valerius have been repurposed," the attendant replied, his tone perfectly neutral. "A death by custom." Lord Valerius, the primary architect of the plot against Cassian, had not been executed. He had been erased. His lands, his titles, and now his very living space were forfeit, absorbed back into the Imperial system. His disgrace was the foundation upon which my new office was built. The Emperor had not just given me power, he had given me the rooms of my first undeclared enemy. It was not a reward, it was a warning, a reminder of the stakes. The chancellery was a suite of 3 rooms in the political heart of the palace, overlooking the central courtyard where edicts were read. It was furnished with a heavy desk of black ironwood and shelves that were conspicuously, unnervingly empty. My work was not to read the record, but to become it. On the desk lay a single object, a heavy steel seal, its face carved with a balanced scale and a closed book. Beside it, a stack of vellum awaited my first pronouncements. I was a living archive, and my judgments would be the new canon. The first test did not take long. It arrived before the sun had set, carried by a nervous-looking scribe from the Office of Imperial Rights. He presented me with a scroll detailing the protocol for the upcoming quarterly procession of banners. It was a minor ceremony, a display of fealty from the Empire's vassal houses. I had reviewed this exact document dozens of times in my old role. I read it. My training was a physical thing, a reflex. My eyes moved over the familiar calligraphy, tracing the prescribed movements, the order of the houses, the duration of the bows. It was all correct. It was all in keeping with a century of precedent. Almost. Near the end, a single line had been added. The banner of House Cretus shall be afforded the honor of the penumbral position in recognition of their long service. It was a masterful piece of sabotage. The language was innocuous, couched in respect. But the penumbral position, the place just to the left and behind the Imperial Regent's own standard, was not an honor. It was a place of specific, codified meaning. For 300 years, it had been reserved for a house in mourning for a line-ending death. To grant it as an honor was to fundamentally corrupt its meaning. It was a lie, a small one, but a lie written into the grammar of the state. And I knew why it was there. House Cretus was an old and powerful family, aligned with the faction that had sought to ruin Cassian. This was their probe, their test. They were asserting their influence, daring me to challenge them over something that would seem, to any outside observer, a trivial point of etiquette. If I approved it, I would prove myself to be a pawn, a figurehead who could be manipulated. I would have failed before my work had even begun. If I vetoed it, I would make a direct enemy of one of the most dangerous families in the Empire. I could have done nothing. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. I picked up a quill. My hand did not shake. I dipped it in the ink, and with the precise, clear script of a trained archivist, I struck out the line. Beside it, I wrote a single sentence. Precedent dictates the penumbral position is a symbol of bereavement, not a grant of favor. To use it as such is a violation of the integrity of the right. Vetoed. A mero, Imperial arbiter. I did not use the new seal. That felt like a step too far, a claim to an authority I did not yet understand. I signed my name. It was enough. The scribe took the scroll, his eyes wide. He bowed low, lower than before, and practically fled the room. I was left alone with the empty shelves and the knowledge that I had just signed a declaration of war. That evening, a visitor came. There was a soft knock on the door to the chancellery, a sound so hesitant it was nearly lost in the oppressive silence of the palace. The guards outside did not announce him. It was Cassian. He looked worn, the strain of his own ordeal still etched around his eyes, but he stood straighter than he had in the great hall. He was a man who had walked to the edge of a precipice and been pulled back. "Arbiter," he began, then stopped. "Aurelia, I am sorry to intrude." "You are not intruding, Administrator," I said, motioning for him to enter. The formality was a shield for us both. "I came to thank you," he said, his voice low. "What you did, it was a risk that no one has taken in living memory. You saved more than my career. You saved the principle of my work." "I only corrected the record," I stated. It was the truth. My action had not been for him, not truly. It had been for the system itself. He gave a small, sad smile. "Yes, the system. And now the Emperor has made you its sole defender." He looked around the stark official room. "This is a dangerous place to be, Aurelia. I am aware." "Are you?" he pressed, his voice earnest. "House Cretus will not forgive your veto. They will see it as a direct attack orchestrated by the Emperor with you as his chosen weapon. They will not move against him. They will move against you." He was telling me nothing I had not already deduced, but hearing it spoken aloud gave it a new, sharper reality. He was not speaking of abstract factions or political maneuvering. He was speaking of people who would now actively work to destroy me. "The Emperor knows this," I said. It was not a question. "He is counting on it," Cassian confirmed. "You are the stone he has thrown into the pond. He is watching the ripples to see which fish are startled from the weeds." He stepped closer. Be careful. The archives give you the truth of the past, but they will not tell you the shape of a lie before it is told. Do not trust overtures of friendship. Do not accept gifts. Question every document. They will not challenge you with a sword. It will be a death by custom, 1,000 small cuts of precedent and procedure until they have you bound. He placed a small folded piece of vellum on my desk. This is a list of minor rights and land use charters scheduled for review in the coming weeks. The ones House Cretus and their allies have an interest in. It is all public record, of course, but perhaps not all collected in one place. I looked from the list to his face. He was giving me a map of the battlefield. It was an act of immense risk for him. Why? I asked. Because you corrected the record, he said simply, and someone has to watch the archivist. He bowed and left me there. I picked up the list. It was a small, tangible piece of data in a sea of unknowns. It was the first move in a game I had never asked to play. I walked to the window and looked down at the courtyard. The last of the day's light caught the gilded spires of the palace, but the stones below were deep in shadow. The Emperor had given me power, but Cassian had given me something far more valuable. He had given me a warning. It was not enough. I knew it would not be enough. Cassian's words did not echo. They settled, a fine layer of dust on every surface of my mind. You are a pawn in his game. He had risked his career, perhaps his life, to bring me this warning, delivering it in the hushed, anonymous corridor behind the lesser scriptorium. His face was a mask of earnest fear. A pawn to be sacrificed? I asked. My voice was steady, a scholar's inquiry into a point of fact. Or a pawn to reach the other side of the board, he countered, his gaze darting toward the corridor's end. It makes little difference to the other pieces. They will try to remove you either way. He gave a short, formal bow, the motion stiff with urgency. Be careful, Arbiter Mero. The Emperor has given you a sword, but he has not given you a shield. Then he was gone. I was left with the silence, which was louder than a scream. I did not return to my old rooms in the archivist's wing. A silent, gray-robed attendant had been waiting for me outside the Great Hall, a human symbol of my new station. He had led me not to a suite of rooms, but to an office, the office of the Arbiter of the Imperial record. It did not exist yesterday. Today, it was carved into the very architecture of the palace, situated in a wing that connected the Imperial archives to the Emperor's private court. A bridge between knowledge and power. A place of profound isolation. I walked there now. The corridor was paneled in dark, unadorned wood, the kind reserved for judicial chambers. It was designed to absorb sound, to create a zone of unnerving quiet. My footsteps were small, swallowed things. I was a pawn. The word was a clinical diagnosis of my condition. A pawn is the most numerous piece, but also the most expendable. It moves forward, never back. Its purpose is to be an obstacle, to create pressure, to be traded for a strategic advantage. Cassian was right. Whether I was meant for sacrifice or for transformation, the immediate result was the same. I was now an object of threat. The attendant, a man whose name I had not been given, stood sentry outside two immense doors of polished ironwood. He opened one for me without a word. I stepped inside. The office was a cage built from knowledge. It was a vast, circular chamber, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with empty shelves. They were made of pale, white stone, a stark contrast to the dark wood of the archives I knew. These were not shelves for holding history. They were shelves waiting to be filled. In the center of the room was a single, massive desk of black basalt. its surface polished to a mirror sheen. On it sat one object, a heavy, leather-bound ledger, its cover stamped with the Emperor's personal seal. Nothing else. No inkwell, no quills, no documents. Just the empty shelves, the cold desk, and the sealed book. The room was a vacuum, waiting for me to give it purpose. The symbol was clear. My predecessor was not a person, but a void. I was the first. There was no precedent for my role, which meant there was no protection in it. Custom is the shield of every functionary and noble in the Empire. I had none. I spent the first hour in that room doing nothing. I walked its perimeter, running my hand along the empty stone. I stood before the desk but did not touch the ledger. I was analyzing the structure of my new power, trying to understand its design. The Emperor had not just given me a title, he had given me an apparatus. The location of the office, its stark emptiness, the single ledger. It was all a message. You are an extension of my will. Your authority is singular. Begin ... my authority. It was a concept as abstract as a theorem. I needed to test it, to see if the system would bend to its logic. An untested power is not power at all. It is a theory. The grey-robed attendant entered, silent as a ghost. He placed a tray with a simple meal on a small side table I hadn't noticed. He moved with an unnerving efficiency that spoke of years of service in the highest circles. He was my keeper as much as my clerk. I require an assistant, I said to his back. He stopped, turning slowly. His face was placid, his eyes holding no discernible emotion. One has been assigned, Arbiter. She is a novitiate from the archives, first class. Her name is Ilara. She is vetted. Vetted by whom? The Emperor's own intelligence, of course. My assistant would also be my observer. Another part of the system's architecture. And I require guards, I added. The Imperial Guard has secured this wing, he replied. None may enter without your authority or the Emperor's. My authority? There it was again. A key to a lock I did not understand. Then send for Ilara, I commanded, and bring me the accession records for the House of Volantis. All of them, including the sealed documents pertaining to the disgrace of Lord Kalen Volantis 70 years ago. This was the test. The Volantis records were a scar on the Imperial record. Lord Kalen had been the Emperor's grandfather's closest friend, disgraced in a treason trial whose records were sealed by Imperial decree. To ask for them was not merely an act of scholarly inquiry. It was an intrusion into the Emperor's own dynastic history. It was a question aimed directly at the throne. Is any knowledge truly forbidden? To me. The attendant's placid expression did not change, but a flicker of something, the barest tightening around his eyes, betrayed him. He had expected me to ask for administrative papers, for budgetary scrolls, for the minutiae of my new office. He had not expected me to immediately reach for a piece of forbidden history. He bowed. As the Arbiter commands. I waited. The waiting was the heart of the test. Power in the Empire is a current. It must flow through established channels. My request would travel from the attendant to the captain of the Imperial Guard, from the captain to the chief archivist, and from the chief archivist, almost certainly, back to the Emperor himself. Each step was an opportunity for my command to be denied, delayed, or lost. If the records did not appear, my power was a sham. I would be a figurehead, a scarecrow placed in the fields to frighten the crows while the rot spread in the roots. An hour later, a young woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and hair pulled back in a severe knot stood at my door. She was dressed in the simple grey robes of an archival novitiate. "Arbiter Merrow," she said, her voice crisp and clear. "I am Ilara. I am here to serve." She showed no awe, no fear, only a quiet readiness that was more intimidating than either. "You will be my only aid," I stated. It was a question. "For now," she answered, her gaze unwavering. "My duties are to manage the Arbiter's correspondence, organize the records you summon, and maintain the security of this office." "The security?" "To ensure that what enters this room does not leave it, Arbiter, and vice versa." She was a lock, another piece of the architecture. Before I could probe further, 2 Imperial guardsmen, their black and gold armor gleaming, arrived bearing a heavy, iron-bound chest. They placed it on the floor before my desk with a heavy thud that seemed to shake the entire chamber. They saluted, not to me, but to the room itself, and then departed. The silence they left behind was thick with consequence. Ilara looked from the chest to me. "The Volantis records, Arbiter." It had worked. The system had bent. My command had been obeyed without question or delay. The Emperor had not intervened. He had let the request be fulfilled. He was watching. He was always watching. I knelt before the chest. The lock was ancient, a complex mechanism of interlocking wheels. Affixed to it was a brittle wax seal bearing the crest of the previous emperor. It was unbroken. For 70 years, this knowledge had been entombed, removed from the living record. It was a lie by omission, a death by custom. I looked at Ilara. "Leave me." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her duty to observe warring with my command to leave. My first true command to my new subordinate. "I will call for you when I need you," I said, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. She bowed her head. "Arbiter." She turned and left, closing the heavy doors behind her, plunging the room back into its profound quiet. I was alone with the chest. I had the power to open it. I had the authority. But Cassian's warning was a cold weight in my stomach. The Emperor had not given me a shield. This chest, and the truth sealed within it, was not a shield. It was a weapon, and I now understood that the first person a weapon puts in danger is the one who wields it. My hand trembled as I reached for the seal. I accepted the power. Now I had to accept its price. I broke the wax. The sound was as small and final as a snapping bone. The wax seal was the color of dried blood. It bore the personal sigil of the Emperor, not the grand public emblem of the Sunstone throne, but a private mark used only for matters of house and dynasty. A stylized raptor, wings folded, its gaze fixed. It was a symbol of judgment held in reserve. Breaking it was not merely an act of accessing a record, it was an act of intrusion into the Emperor's own history, a domain more sacred and more jealously guarded than any temple. My fingers, steady until this moment, trembled slightly as they hovered over the brittle wax. The silence of my new office was absolute. It was a sterile silence, unlike the living quiet of the archives, which had always hummed with the faint rustle of vellum and the scent of aging paper. This silence was an absence. It was the sound of a vacuum, a space cleared for me and the power I had been given. A space that could just as easily become a tomb. I pressed my thumb against the seal. The wax gave way with a sharp crack, the sound unnaturally loud in the still room. It was not a scream, but it was a rupture, a violation of precedent that had stood for 40 years. The ribbon fell away. I slid the heavy cylinder of the scroll case open and drew out the documents within. There were 3 scrolls, bound in black silk. The first was the public proclamation of Lord Volantis's disgrace, written in the high formal script of the Imperial Chancellor. It listed his crimes in stark, unambiguous terms: embezzlement of state funds, conspiracy with a foreign power, gross dereliction of duty. It was a litany of corruption so complete, so thorough, that it left no room for doubt. It was a political execution rendered in ink. I had read copies of this proclamation before. It was a foundational text in the study of modern imperial law, a case study in the swift and total enforcement of custom. A death by custom. But this was the original. The ink was faded to a deep brown, the parchment heavy and cool in my hands. I unrolled it, my eyes scanning the familiar text, but my mind was not on the words. I was looking at the structure, the architecture of the lie. An archivist does not simply read a document, they interrogate it. They study its form, its materials, its context. The truth of a record is often found not in what it says, but in how it is said. And here there was an error. It was small, a detail so minor that only someone who had spent a lifetime with such documents would ever see it. The final seal at the bottom of the proclamation, the one that validated the Chancellor's authority, was stamped slightly askew. In the Empire, custom is not just about tradition. It is the law, and the law of an imperial proclamation demands perfect alignment. An angled seal was a sign of haste or distress. It was a crack in a facade of absolute certainty. My breath caught. It was nothing. It was everything. I set the proclamation aside and reached for the second scroll. This one was different. It was not a public document, but a transcript of the tribunal, sealed under the authority of the Emperor himself. The script was smaller, a scribe's hurried but precise hand capturing the proceedings. I unrolled it slowly. The names of the inquisitors were a roll call of the Empire's most powerful houses: Cretus, Valerius, Orton, the very families who now watched my every move. I scanned the testimony. Lord Volantis was not even present. He was judged in absentia, his guilt already a foregone conclusion. Witnesses were called, ledgers presented. The evidence was overwhelming. But as I read, a cold knot formed in my stomach. The evidence was too perfect. The ledgers showing the flow of embezzled funds were pristine, the witnesses' accounts flawlessly consistent. There were no contradictions, no hesitations, no human messiness. It was a performance of justice, not the thing itself. The system was designed to produce this outcome. I saw how rituals designed to ensure fairness were now instruments to enforce a narrative. It was the same corruption I had witnessed at the ceremony of imperial renewal, the same subtle twisting of meaning. But this was older, deeper. This was the blueprint. The third scroll was the reason for the other two. It was a personal letter, written not on state parchment, but on thin, private stationery. The script was not a scribe's. It was an elegant, powerful hand, the lines flowing with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. The signature at the bottom made the air leave my lungs. Volantis. But it was the salutation that stopped my heart. My dearest brother. I read the words again and again. I placed the letter flat on the polished table and stood, walking to the window. Below, the manicured gardens of the inner palace were empty. The Emperor had given me this office with its view of his private grounds, a constant reminder of his presence, of his gaze. Brother. The official histories, The ones I had memorized as a child listed Emperor Marcus as the only son of the previous emperor to survive to adulthood. There were no brothers. To suggest otherwise was not just historical error. It was heresy. I returned to the desk, my movements stiff, robotic. I forced myself to read the letter. It was not a confession. It was an argument. Volantis was not writing to a distant emperor. He was writing to his younger brother, Marcus. He was not defending himself against charges of treason. He was pleading, reasoning, warning. Asterisk ... You mistake rigidity for strength. Asterisk, he wrote. The customs that built this empire will be the cause of its collapse. They have become a cage, not a scaffold. We honor the past by allowing for a future, and a future requires change. A system without a mechanism for correction is a system designed for failure. It will grow brittle and it will shatter. He went on, his words a desperate, brilliant torrent of logic. He outlined a proposal, the creation of an independent office, an arbiter whose sole purpose would be to examine the rituals and customs of the state, a figure empowered to veto any act that served factional interest over the integrity of the system itself, a diagnostic tool to find the cracks in the foundation before the entire structure came down. He had described my office, my role, my power, 40 years before its creation. Lord Volantis was not disgraced for corruption. He was disgraced for being right. The emperor had not punished his own brother for treason, but for an idea he had silenced, buried, and then, 4 decades later, resurrected. And he had placed me at its center. I was not a tool. I was an echo. I was the ghost of a failed argument, given flesh and a title. The emperor was not testing his court. He was rerunning an old experiment, one that had already cost his brother his name, his honor, and his place in history. The question was, what had changed? Why now? Was this repentance, or was it something else? A cold, calculated next step in a game that began long before I was born. My power was not new. It was inherited. And so, I suspected, was the danger. The knock on my door was soft, but it felt like a physical blow. I hastily rolled the letter and slid it back into its silk binding, my hands clumsy. The other scrolls lay exposed on my desk, a testament to my transgression. "Enter," I said, my voice thin. It was Cassian. He slipped inside, closing the heavy door behind him and engaging the lock. His face was pale, his usual composure gone. He looked not at me, but at the scrolls on my desk. "Gods, Aurelia." "It's true then," he whispered. He ran a hand through his hair. "The entire court is buzzing. They said you summoned the Volantis records. I told them it was a baseless rumor. I told them you were a scholar, not a fool." "The two are not mutually exclusive," I said. The words were flat. I felt strangely detached, an observer in my own body. "This isn't a game?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping even lower, urgent and frayed. "This isn't about correcting a minor procedural flaw with House Cretus. This is the Imperial family. This is the Emperor's own history. There are lines you do not cross. There are doors you do not open." "The Emperor gave me the key," I stated. It was a simple fact. "He gave you a sword to see if you would fall on it." Cassian's control finally snapped. His voice was a pained hiss. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You haven't just made an enemy of a noble house. You have declared yourself a player in the Emperor's own succession, in the history of the throne itself. The Imperial Guard answers to the Emperor, but their loyalty is to the integrity of the dynasty. You are now a threat to that integrity." He was right. I knew he was right. Everything he said was the logical, political reality. It was the truth of the world I had lived in my entire life. But it was no longer the only truth I knew. "What was Lord Volantis's crime, Cassian?" I asked, my voice quiet. He looked at me, confused. "What?" "Treason. Embezzlement. Everyone knows." "What if everyone is wrong?" He stared at me, the implications of my question slowly dawning on his face. The fear in his eyes was replaced by a dawning horror. "Aurelia, no. Stop. Whatever you think you found, bury it. Burn the scroll. Tell the Emperor you found nothing. This is your one chance to walk away from this." I could have done that. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But I was looking at the proclamation of disgrace, at the perfectly constructed lie. I was looking at the letter from a man erased from history for speaking a truth the Emperor was only now willing to hear. I was wrong before. My purpose was not to be a diagnostic tool. A tool is passive. A tool does not have a will. The Emperor did not give me power to see if I would be broken by the system. He gave me power to see if I would break it. "I can't do that, Cassian," I said, and the quiet certainty in my own voice surprised me. I picked up the letter from the disgraced lord, the brother, the prophet. The record is incomplete. The silence of the archive was no longer a comfort. It was a vacuum, amplifying the frantic pulse in my wrists. The vellum of the scroll was cool and dry beneath my fingertips, a stark contrast to the heat rising in my face. I read the words again, and a third time. The ink was faded, the script precise, but the meaning was immutable. Proposal for the reformation of the ceremony of renewal to include the creation of an office of Imperial arbiter tasked with ensuring the integrity of the record against factional revision. Submitted by Lord Kalen Volantis. The date was 40 years ago. Lord Volantis, the Emperor's brother. The Emperor had erased him from history for proposing the very office I now held. He had not simply disagreed with the idea, he had treated it as an act of treason so profound that the man who conceived it had to be unwritten. His name was scoured from the rolls, his portraits removed, his presence in the Imperial record reduced to a sealed and disgraced file. A death by custom. And now I was the arbiter. I let the scroll roll shut. The sound of the weighted ends clicking together was louder than a scream. For a moment, I did nothing. I simply stood in the heart of the archives, the sanctum of truth, and understood that I was the living embodiment of a 40-year-old lie. I was wrong. I had believed the Emperor saw in my defiance a useful tool, a way to diagnose the sickness in his court. I thought he was an innovator, a man willing to break with precedent to achieve a higher goal. It was a logical, if dangerous, conclusion. It was incorrect. The Emperor is not an innovator. He is a custodian. He had not created something new for me. He had resurrected something old. He had taken his brother's disgraced idea, an idea so dangerous it had cost a man his place in history, and he had given it to me. This was not a reward. It was not a gambit. It was a sentence. The question was for what crime and what the execution would be. My power was not my own. My title was a ghost. I walked back to my newly assigned offices adjacent to the archive's main reading room. The guards posted at my door, men from the Emperor's own Imperial Legion, straightened as I approached. They were a symbol of my new authority. Before, I had seen them as protection. Now, I saw them as wardens. They were not there to keep others out. They were there to keep me in, a rare specimen pinned to a board. an experiment in progress. Inside, the room was sparse, a heavy desk of dark wood, a single chair, shelves that were still mostly empty. On the desk sat the Arbiter's seal. It was carved from obsidian, heavy in the palm, the symbol of the balanced scales etched into its face. It was the instrument of my power, the authority to veto, to halt, to demand integrity. 40 years ago, a man had died, in essence, for suggesting this very object should exist. Why? An arbiter was a check on the slow, creeping corruption of the noble houses. It was a tool for stability, for enforcing the system's core principles. Why would an emperor, even a new one, see that as a threat, unless the corruption reached the throne itself? Or, and this thought was colder, unless the emperor was not interested in preventing corruption. I saw it then, the architecture of the past 40 years. An emperor takes the throne. His brother, perhaps idealistic, perhaps ambitious, proposes a radical check on the power of the court, and by extension, the emperor himself. The emperor cannot allow this. It would hamstring his ability to maneuver, to consolidate his own power in those crucial early years. So he makes an example of his brother. He uses the full, crushing weight of imperial custom to erase him, a terrifying demonstration of his own authority. The message to the other great houses is clear. Do not challenge the system, because I am the system. For 40 years, that message holds. The houses grow complacent. Their corruption becomes structural, predictable. They believe the emperor is one of them, a protector of the status quo that benefits them all. And then I open a book. The emperor did not see an archivist defending a principle. He saw an opportunity. He saw a weapon he had forged 4 decades ago and locked away. He saw a ghost he could finally unleash. He did not give me power because I was defiant. He gave me power because my specific brand of defiance, a rigid, intellectual adherence to the original text of the law, was exactly what his brother had offered. I was the echo of Caelin Volantis. He aimed me at the court, and my first act was to unseal his brother's name. It was not a coincidence. It was the intended result. He knew the archivist in me could not leave a sealed record alone. He knew I would seek the precedent for my own existence. He had counted on it. The question was no longer what had happened to Lord Volantis. The question was what the emperor intended to happen now that his brother's name was spoken again. A sharp knock on the door broke my trance. Before I could answer, it opened and Cassian slipped inside. He did not wait for an invitation. His movements hurried and furtive. The easy caution he usually wore had been replaced by a stark, unconcealed fear. "They know," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. He did not need to specify who they were. "Know what precisely?" I asked. My own voice was steady. It was the only part of me that was. In the Empire, precision is a shield. "That you unsealed the Volantis file." He took a step closer, his eyes scanning the empty shelves as if assassins might be hiding behind them. "Aurelia, that name has not been uttered in the open court for my entire lifetime. It is a dynastic taboo. It is not a matter of a disgraced lord. It is the emperor's own blood. It is a matter of the imperial record," I stated. The seal was temporary. The justification for its continuation was insufficient. The words sounded hollow even to me, the rote defense of a bureaucrat. Cassian stared at me, his expression a mix of disbelief and pity. "Do you think that matters? You have forced the court to remember the emperor had a brother who vanished. You have reminded every great house, Tyrell, Valerius, Corvin, that the Emperor's power was solidified with an act of fraternal erasure. That is not a stable foundation. You are not tapping at the cracks in the wall, Aurelia. You are digging at the cornerstone of the entire regime. He was right. I had seen it as a matter of systemic integrity. They saw it as a matter of dynastic succession and forbidden history. My intellectual exercise was their existential threat. The whispers are everywhere, Cassian continued, pacing the short length of the room. It is not just about your power anymore. This is different. Before, you were an anomaly, a disruption. Now, you are a threat to memory itself. You are the woman who speaks the name of the ghost. I remained seated, my hands resting on the cool, solid wood of the desk. My gaze fell again to the obsidian seal. The woman who speaks the name of the ghost. He was right. That is what I had become, but not by my own choice. The Emperor knew I would do this, Cassian, I said, the words falling into the tense silence of the room. Cassian stopped pacing. He turned to me slowly. What do you mean? Lord Volantis was disgraced for proposing the creation of an Imperial arbiter. The blood drained from Cassian's face. He understood instantly. He saw the same chilling architecture I did. He was a man who understood the mechanics of power, and I had just handed him the blueprint for a machine designed to kill. He is using you, Cassian breathed. He is using his brother's memory. For what? To terrorize them? To root out those who remember? I believe he is using me to finish what his brother started, I said. The realization settled over me, cold and absolute. Lord Volantis proposed reform and was destroyed for it. The Emperor is now imposing that same reform, but he is not doing it himself. He is using me, an outsider, an archivist. I am not his hand, I am his weapon. If I fail, if the court destroys me, he loses nothing but a troublesome archivist. The idea is disgraced once more. But if I succeed, if you succeed, Cassian finished, his voice grim, you will have torn the court apart from the inside, doing the work he could never do himself without appearing to be a tyrant. He will be seen as the patient emperor, wisely managing the chaos an upstart arbiter created. I nodded. It was a perfect strategy. Flawless. It accounted for every variable. My principles, the court's greed, the weight of history. I was not a pawn in his game. I was the board itself. After Cassian left, with a final desperate plea for me to be careful, I sat in the growing twilight for a long time. The fear did not lessen, but it changed. It crystallized from a formless dread into a sharp, clear intellectual problem. The Emperor had started a game 40 years ago by silencing his brother. He had now resumed it with me as his primary piece. He was waiting. He was watching to see if I understood the rules. My survival, I realized, did not depend on the guards at my door or the power of my seal. It depended on my ability to read the oldest text of all, the mind of the man who had written me into existence. And I had to do it before the other players in the game decided to simply remove me from the board. I picked up the obsidian seal. It was not a symbol of my power. It was the legacy of Kalen Volantis, and it was now my turn to play. The silence of the sealed archive was absolute. It was a dead space, a room designed to entomb information. The air, thin and dry, tasted of dust and decaying vellum. In my hands, the folio containing the life and disgrace of Lord Kalen Volantis felt heavier than stone. Not because of its physical weight, but because of the truth it contained. A truth so monumental it had warped the very structure of Imperial history. He was the Emperor's brother. The words did not scream in my mind. They settled, cold and dense, a sediment at the bottom of my consciousness. I traced the faded script with a finger that did not tremble. Caelin Volantis, second son of the late Emperor Valerius, brother to the reigning Emperor Theron. It was stated as simple fact, a piece of genealogical record that, outside this room, had ceased to exist. I had been trained to see history as a structure. Events were stones, records were the mortar holding them in place. What I was looking at was not a missing stone. It was evidence of a foundation deliberately broken and rebuilt on a lie. The erasure of Lord Volantis was not a passive act of forgetting. It was an act of architectural sabotage, carried out with the same precision I used to catalogue my scrolls. Every public record amended, every court transcript altered, every lineage scroll re-inked. It was a project of immense scale and flawless execution. Only an emperor could command such a perfect annihilation of truth. The emperor had a brother. The emperor disgraced him, erased him, and 40 years later resurrected the very idea that had caused his brother's fall. He did not just give me power, he gave me his brother's power. I closed the folio. The soft slap of leather against parchment was the only sound. I was wrong. I had thought my role as arbiter was a strategic move in a current political game, a scalpel given to me to cut out the rot of present-day factions. I saw now that I was not a scalpel. I was an echo, a ghost. I was the living embodiment of a 40-year-old argument between two brothers, and one of them was dead, or worse than dead, forgotten. My mind, trained in analysis, began to construct the possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. First, the simple explanation. The emperor was young then, his throne new. Perhaps he had been forced by the court's powerful factions, the same ones who despise me now, to make an example of his progressive brother. In this scenario, his creation of the arbiter's office was a correction, a final, delayed victory for Caelin. It was a story of regret and eventual justice. It was the most palatable theory. It was also the least likely. The emperor did not strike me as a man ruled by regret. He was a man who ruled. Second, the political explanation. Caelin's proposal was a threat to the established order. By destroying his own brother for it, the emperor performed the ultimate act of consolidation. He proved to the old families that no one, not even his own blood, was above the sanctity of custom. He earned their loyalty through a terrible sacrifice. Now, 40 years later, those same families had grown complacent, their corruption a greater threat than any reform. So he unearthed the weapon he had long ago buried, placing it in the hands of an outsider. Me? It was a brilliant, ruthless, long-term strategy. This felt closer to the truth. It fit the man who watched a ceremony crumble with unnerving patience. It fit the system he commanded. But it was the third possibility that hollowed me out, the one that whispered of something beyond strategy, something personal and unknowable. What if the argument was never about the office of arbiter at all? The office was merely the stage. The real conflict was between two brothers, a rivalry so deep it had to be ended with the utter annihilation of one. And now, for reasons I could not fathom, the emperor was restaging the play. He had cast me in his brother's role. Was I meant to succeed where Caelin had failed? Or was I meant to be the final public proof that his brother had been wrong all along? I was a footnote in the Imperial record brought to life to settle a ghost's debt. The thought was a physical weight. I stood, my joints stiff. The archive was no longer a sanctuary. The knowledge it held was not a shield. It was a poison I had willingly ingested. I had to leave. I had to breathe air that was not saturated with the dust of this monumental secret. I replaced the folio, sliding it back into its slot in the wall of the forgotten. The mechanism groaned softly as I resealed the panel. The lie was once again intact, but I carried the truth with me. I walked the palace corridors with a new kind of sight. I saw not just the rigid ceremony of the guards, the precise angles of their salutes, the calculated steps of the courtiers. I saw the performance. I saw the decades of practice that went into maintaining the illusion. The empire was not a fortress of tradition. It was a theater, and the emperor was its sole playwright and director. I found Cassian in the lower gardens, the one place in the palace where things were allowed to grow with a semblance of wildness. He was standing by a fountain, the water whispering over moss-slicked stone. He turned as I approached, his face a study in polite inquiry that sharpened into concern when he saw my expression. "Arbiter," he said, his voice low, "you look as if you've been reading from the forbidden registry." His casual guess was so close to the mark, it startled a dry laugh out of me. Something like that. I did not go to him for comfort. Cassian was not a friend. He was an ally of circumstance, and his value was his pragmatism. He understood the currents of the court in a way I, a scholar of the past, was only just beginning to learn. "The office of arbiter," I began, choosing my words with the care of a scribe selecting ink. "It is not a new idea." He nodded slowly. "Few ideas are. Most reforms are simply old heresies given a second chance. It was a politician's answer, safe and meaningless. A man was disgraced for proposing it once before," I pressed. "Decades ago. He was erased from the record." Cassian's face lost its warmth. The pragmatist took over, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the surrounding archways, ensuring we were alone. "Aurelia," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There are archives and there are graves. You must learn the difference. Some truths are not meant to be excavated." This man's proposal was identical to the decree that created my office, I said, ignoring his warning. I needed to see his reaction. He was branded a traitor for it. Why? "Because he lost," Cassian said, the answer brutal in its simplicity. "In the Empire, the difference between a traitor and a reformer is only a matter of who holds power at the end of the day. This man, whoever he was, challenged the system and the system broke him. That is the beginning and the end of the story." "I don't believe that." "You are a scholar. You believe in cause and effect," he countered, stepping closer. "But politics is not a science. The emperor does not operate on precedent. He creates it. He may have punished this man 40 years ago because the timing was wrong. He may have done it because he disliked the man's face. He may have done it for a reason so complex it would be incomprehensible to us. The why of it does not matter. The only thing that matters is that you are not this man. You did not challenge the system. The system, in the form of the emperor, chose you." He was trying to reassure me, to place me on the winning side of the equation. But his words only confirmed my fear. I was not an actor with my own will. I was a tool. "And what if the emperor's goal is to see me broken as well?" I asked. The question hung in the humid air between us. Cassian's expression was grim. "Then he will. But he wouldn't have gone to such trouble. A death by custom would have been far easier. No, he wants something from you, from your office. My advice, Arbiter, is to give him what he wants and never ask what it is for. Investigate the corruptions of today Fix the rituals, build your authority, do the job you were given. Do not go digging into the foundations. Some are built over tombs. If you uncover them, the whole palace could collapse on top of you. He was right. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. I could have done nothing, but the record was corrupted. A man had been stolen from history. My entire life, my entire purpose was dedicated to the integrity of that history. To ignore this was to betray not just the archive, but myself. It was to accept that truth was subject to power. I could not. "Thank you for your counsel, Cassian," I said. The words were a dismissal. He held my gaze for a long moment, a flicker of something, pity perhaps, in his eyes. "Be careful, Aurelia," he murmured. "The Emperor's game is not the only one being played, and you are now the most valuable piece on the board." I left him by the fountain and walked back toward the spire that held my new, lonely quarters. The sun was setting, casting the marble corridors in long, distorted shadows. Every statue seemed to watch me pass. Every whisper from a distant chamber sounded like my name. Cassian's warning echoed in my mind, but it was drowned out by a colder, clearer imperative. I was the arbiter of the Imperial record. The record was a man's life, and it had been falsified. My duty was clear. I had to find out what really happened to Lord Kalen Volantis. I had to restore the record. His fate was a precedent, and as any scholar knows, a precedent unexamined is a sentence waiting to be repeated. I would not walk to my own death by custom, ignorant of the path laid before me. I would walk with my eyes open, one hand on the truth, no matter how sharp its edges were.